from the studios, let's talk about the Nebraska Senate race. Now, you might think to yourself, under ordinary circumstances, why the hell are we talking about Nebraska? Well, part of the reason we're talking about Nebraska is that actually for once, well, for twice, we'll get to that in a minute, they actually might have a competitive Senate race this year. And guess what? They actually had a competitive Senate race in 2024, and they might very well again in 2026, and it's because of the same person. His name is Dan Osborn. So let's set the stage on Nebraska for you and then talk about why we think this might be a race to watch over the next 6 months. So the incumbent senator here is a guy by the name of Pete Ricketts. He is a Republican. He is a former governor of the state of Nebraska. He is now one of Nebraska's senators. He is running for re-election in 2026. Nebraska, ordinarily a pretty red state. So Nebraska used to, back in the day, elect some Democrats. And we're not talking all that long ago. We're talking within my lifetime. They have elected Democrats to the U.S. Senate. For example, Nebraska had Bob Kerrey as a U.S. Senator. They had Ben Nelson as a U.S. Senator. And we're not talking that long ago. We're talking as far back as like the 2000s. So, as red as you think Nebraska is now, and it probably is, Nebraska hasn't been a ruby red state forever. There have been Democrats that have had electoral success in the state. However, in this Senate race, as it was in 2024, there is not going to be a Democrat in the race. And why is that? Because the Democratic nominee who just won her primary yesterday, her name is Cindy Burbank. She is intending to drop out of the Senate race and endorse the independent candidate who ran in 2024. He's running again in 2026 by the name of Dan Osborn. So let's just take a look at the Democratic primary results here, and I'll tell you in a second why this matters. So you can see in this U.S. Senate primary, Cindy Burbank, Democrat, getting 89% in her primary. She ran against a guy by the name of Bill Forbes. He only got about 11% of the vote. And why this is important is because Forbes was accused, especially by Burbank during the campaign, of being a plant. So the theory is that Forbes, who reportedly is pro-life and has supported Trump in the past, the theory is that he was inserted into this race to win the Democratic nomination and split the vote against Ricketts to prevent Dan Osborn from having a chance at winning the race. So Cindy Burbank ran for this Senate seat saying, we got to stop this guy. And she ran on a campaign platform of, the things that a Democrat would normally run on. But really her key campaign plank was, if you let me win the nomination, I'm going to drop out. I'm going to endorse Dan Osborn, and we're going to beat Pete Ricketts. And Democratic voters responded in kind to that. Of course, she won this race in a landslide. So what do we have now? We have the Ricketts versus Osborn race that Dan Osborn wanted. Now, Dan Osborn ran in 2024 against the other senator from Nebraska. Her name is Deb Fischer. He only lost by 7 points. It was something like 53-46. In fact, with rounding, it was actually more like 53-47. And you don't get a lot of Senate races in a state like Nebraska like that anymore. But Dan Osborn, in what turned out to be a pretty decent year for the Republicans, he actually did really well for himself. So, of course, now we know the Democrats are not going to have a candidate that is actively campaigning, and the Democratic nominee will be campaigning for Dan Osborn. So that is going to help to clear the field. Essentially what we're going to have at this point is a 2-candidate race. You've got 2 major candidates. Like I said, Osborn did pretty well, all things considered, 2 years ago, and now he's going to try again in what we think is going to be a much more favorable year to Democrats. Still 6 months away from the election, so anything, I suppose, can happen. But I think we're building to a point now where I think you can say it's certainly looking like the political environment is going to be much more favorable to the Democrats than 2 years ago. But of course, Osborn is not a Democrat. Osborn has not said that he's going to caucus with the Democrats. Osborn is running as an independent. However, he is an independent that is running with the backing of Democrats in Nebraska. Democrats are saying we are not going to recruit a candidate in this race. We don't want to have a candidate in this race. Cindy Burbank won that nomination with the express purpose of spiking her own nomination and helping Osborn win. So that is just setting the stage for where we are. Now, Nebraska being in play in the U.S. Senate, that would really make the Senate map much more interesting. So you've got potential Republican losses, for example, in North Carolina. In fact, I think if that election were held right now, I think it would be a loss. You have a potential Republican loss in Maine. You have a potential Republican loss maybe even in a state like Ohio. Or if things really go well for the Democrats, a state like Texas or Alaska. So the Republicans are on defense in a number of places. And that's not to say that the Democrats aren't on defense in some states too. There's an open seat in Michigan. There's an open seat in New Hampshire. These are seats that the Democrats want to try to hold on to. But even though Dan Osborn is not a Democrat, he is an independent, Democrats would certainly take one less Republican being in the U.S. Senate. So Osborn potentially being a winning candidate is a very, very interesting proposition for them. It is definitely better for them than the alternative. But as for right now, we still have this Nebraska Senate race as likely Republican. We are keeping it there for now. I want to also stress, too, that aside from the fact that Nebraska is generally a Republican state and that somebody like Pete Ricketts is going to have a lot of money for his campaign and the party infrastructure in the state, which is pretty strong, is going to be supporting him. The real reason that I'm shying away from moving this rating right now from likely Republican is the fact that there has been no independent polling at all. However, I expect that to change now that the primaries in Nebraska have occurred. Now that we know this is basically going to be a two-candidate race. Now I think, especially with some people thinking that the Senate might be in play and that things could get very interesting over the next 6 months, I think there are going to be some pollsters that are going to be interested in seeing what happens in Nebraska. And for the record, there has been polling in Nebraska for the U.S. Senate race, but it is not independent polling. So I just want to be very, very clear about that. So, for example, there's an outfit called Tavern Research. It, from what I understand, is Democratic aligned. If that's incorrect, I apologize, and someone can correct me, but it looks like they're Democratic aligned. And this poll came out within the last few days before the primary, and it was 1,165 likely voters. And it had Osborn 47 to 42 ahead of Ricketts with 12% undecided. I mean, that is a really, really good number. So what that firm also did, it looks like, they also polled a Ricketts versus Burbank race. And they came up with Ricketts 48, Burbank 39. So a 9-point lead for Ricketts there. But Ricketts down 5 against Osborn. I am taking that with a grain of salt because I really would like to see like some independent pollster get on the phone to some people in Nebraska or however the hell they do it now. They do it online. I don't know how the pollsters do it now. So the polling methods have changed, but I would like to see some pollster get out to Nebraska because I think the possibility is there that something is going to happen. I definitely do not think that this should be safe Republican. And I'm not even considering the fact that the polls say that, you know, Osborn could be up a couple points in this race right now because I want to see independent polling. I definitely do not think this is safe. Also, just considering the fact that Osborn did pretty well, all things considered, in 2024 in a tough environment. It does seem like Osborn has some appeal to people who in Nebraska wouldn't necessarily vote for a Democrat, but they like him. They like his background as a union guy, and maybe they relate to him more. So I think this is a very interesting Senate race to keep an eye on. This is definitely one that later in the fall could just come out of nowhere and end up being competitive. So I think you owe it to yourself, if you're a political observer and if you're very curious about the midterm elections this year, to keep an eye on the Nebraska Senate race. And the thing is, too, I'm going to just take this with a grain of salt because it is a Democratic firm or a Democratic aligned firm. But in that poll, again, Ricketts at 48% against the Democratic nominee if she had stayed in the race. I mean, a Republican incumbent under 50% in Nebraska, like that's not too great. So definitely bookmark this race. I still think it's likely Republican for now. But if we get to the point where we start seeing some independent polling confirming that this race is going to be close, then I would expect that we will move this rating quickly. So just to wrap this up, so this channel right now is called Election Yard. In the coming days and weeks, it will not be called Election Yard anymore. We have new name, new brand identity coming out. You can still follow our socials, which we will show you in a second. Of course, the handles are going to change soon, but it'll still be us. So like and subscribe, follow us on social media. We'll see you soon.